So thank you. You may be confused if you know me as Jim Cowie from Renesys. Fortunately, this summer Renesys joined forces with Dyne, and we became Dyne Research. So we're going to continue the work of Renesys, the blogs, and the website, and presentations like this under the auspices of Dyne Research, which is a wonderful thing for us. And I've joined them as chief scientist. You may know me as the founder at Renesys. But these are really the interesting topics that we like to study when we take a look at the structure and history of the internet. Something that's always interested me is how the ancient cities of the world, the traditional crossroads, are the same cities that become the critical hubs of internet infrastructure. And that's to be expected, because that's where the roads, the transport, the people, the networks of traditional connectivity existed. And in great cities like Baku, you'll see that the connectivity of the old days you now see in the connectivity of the modern world. So we'll take a look today at some of the digital Silk Road, the modern augmentation of traditional routes. Okay, are we ready to go? Yeah. As soon as we get our full screen. So one of the interesting sites nearby, and this is my first visit to Baku, so I hope to have some time to go see it, is a classic fire temple. Azerbaijan is so blessed with natural resources that the gas literally comes out of the ground. And for centuries and centuries, people came to marvel at the fact that there were eternal flames here and built temples around them. And before there was the internet, we saw cultural transmission. We saw Sanskrit inscriptions here in Baku, thousands of kilometers from India, because this was the place where people came to talk and to trade. And so we have Hindu and Zoroastrian temples in Baku. This is because the Silk Road was the original network of networks. We sometimes think that we invented the first network of networks in the internet. But the Silk Road, of course, was here for thousands of years. And it was based on cultural transmission and economics, people trading, based on local need, merchants establishing trade routes, trade networks, trying to make money, and built chains of long-distance relationships, very much like the modern internet, that were robust for many centuries and then could be very fragile and be swept away, but always seem to come back. So when we think about the Silk Road, there were not really one, there were really two. There was the terrestrial Silk Road, which you see in red here, stretching to China, and then there was the later blue routes, the sea lanes. And these were two Silk Roads in competition with each other, just as today the terrestrial internet is in many ways in competition with the submarine fiber optic cable network. And you know that the Silk Road itself, especially the terrestrial portion, really went into decline around the 14th century for a number of reasons. So Byzantium had reached the end of its days. The Mongol Empire had hit some hard times and were unable to guarantee the safety of the roads end to end as they had for so many years. The Black Death was spreading. But perhaps more importantly, Europe had started to build ships. And if you'll excuse an internet metaphor, end-to-end transmission, single carriers who could get you from Europe to Asia in boats, replaced local handoffs. They replaced these chains of local relationships that kept the terrestrial Silk Road resilient. And so here's a Portuguese caravel. This was how you got traffic from one end of the network to the other in the late 14th and into the 15th century. And so there were huge changes afoot. If you take a look at today's submarine cable map, you actually see that the submarine cable map looks almost exactly like the ancient trade routes that people sailed to get from here to there. So then the question is, what about terrestrial? Are we on the verge of rebuilding a terrestrial internet that would mirror the ancient Silk Road terrestrial trade networks? So it helps to think, perhaps, about the different ways that people build terrestrial networks. Traditionally, you don't simply build a terrestrial network. You build it out of fiber that was laid for some other purpose or along some other right-of-way. Perhaps you built it following a railway network. And here you can see a nice map of the different terrestrial rail networks that exist in the former CIS and along the southern route through Turkey and the Caucasus and Iran and in South Asia. And it's interesting here to see that there were breaks of gauge, right, between the old Russian imperial wide standard and the rest of the southern parts. But nonetheless, this was a unified network of rail, maybe once again, and certainly a lot of important fiber routes follow this network. Maybe more interestingly for Azerbaijan, fiber routes follow energy pipelines. So when people install gas pipelines or oil pipelines, they also put in place fiber optic cables for the operation of the system for transmission of operational data. But there's a lot of bandwidth left over, and this fiber can be used for other purposes, like supporting the internet. And so we have the routes that go through Baku for pipelines to Novorossiysk and Supsa and Erzurum, maybe someday Turkmenbashi, if we get a cable or a pipeline across the Caspian Sea. And this becomes very complex very rapidly because the internet is basically not very political. Energy routes are extremely political. And so inevitably, the internet gets caught up in the complications of the politics of energy. And so every project that goes through, whether that be Nabucco or the South Stream or all these other planned projects, they all create potential new fiber routes, new ways of doing business on the internet, which could really change the game, depending on whether the project happens or doesn't happen. So when we take a look at the digital Silk Road, what we see is that we have spheres of influence politically driving the terrestrial internet. So the basic story is that we have demand end-to-end. Europe and East Asia want to talk to each other. But also there's a lot of emerging communities, including here in Azerbaijan, who want connectivity. They want connectivity to other people in the region. They want connectivity to Western Europe. They want connectivity to the United States. And this all has to be built. And the key terrestrial transmission routes are those that go through Russia or Kazakhstan or Iran or Turkey. And so all of these partnerships together help determine the transmission routes. And the Caucasus, and specifically the nations around the Caspian Sea, are going to be extremely pivotal just because of geography, as they always have been. So here's the old Renesys active measurement infrastructure, and I need to update the slide because now it's the Dyn Research active measurement infrastructure. These are all the places where we have measurement points in the internet. In some of these places we are studying BGP routing, so we're collecting BGP routes to understand the structure of the internet. In other places we're doing active measurement, trace-based and ping-based measurement to study the performance of the internet among all of these points. And among the places that we have instrumented to measure the Silk Road from are these great ancient cities on the left. And so we can build up a fairly good picture of what latencies and dynamics look like on the internet in this region. So the first observation I would make is that distances are very deceiving on the internet. Internet traffic rarely takes the local path. It rarely takes a straight line path. Packets can go great distances end to end based on peering relationships and who is buying transit from who. And because latency, the delays that packets experience, are so important to customer experience, a lot of companies are now taking a look at how their service providers interconnect and establish peering, and in what locations. So let's take a look at the local neighborhood. What we'll do is we'll start here in Baku, and we will gradually expand the round trip time that a packet can take and see how far we can get. So if I only give us 50 milliseconds, how far can I get? This is a 7-day median to an entire city. So it may be possible to get to some of these places faster, but this is the median for the entire city over a long period of time. So from here, you can get to a couple of southern Russian cities, Krasnodar, Astrakhan, and that's because of a direct connection that exists between Delta here in Azerbaijan and the southern Russia Rostelecom AS. So let's widen the scope a little bit. Let's give ourselves another 50 milliseconds. If we get up to 100, we basically see that we can reach 2 locations and the things around them. We can make it to Frankfurt, and we can make it to Moscow. And that, in turn, allows us to reach, within the 100 millisecond limit, places like Dublin, or all the way out to Novosibirsk or Tashkent. If we go a little farther, if I give us 150 milliseconds, we can make it all the way to Iceland. We can make it all the way to Khabarovsk, just barely. We can make it to Djibouti. And finally, we can make it to our neighbor, Tbilisi. So how can that be? Why does it take 150 milliseconds to go to Tbilisi, which is like 500 kilometers that way? Look at Yerevan. To make it to Yerevan from here, it's normal. One would not expect there to be direct connectivity between Baku and Yerevan. The traffic goes to Sofia, which is reasonable. It is the nearest large peering city where we can get transit from, in this case, level 3. And the packets have a very consistent latency that you can see, just over 100 milliseconds to go Baku, Sofia, Sofia back to Yerevan on the submarine cable underneath the Black Sea. Tbilisi is even closer, and it's only 560 kilometers, but there are very different outcomes depending on who you're peering with and where. So most cases will end up taking 100 to 150 milliseconds. And that's because it's long-haul transit through Delta's partner Caucasus Online, which is going to Baku, or to Sofia. And as you can see, there's a shift in the graph. There's a drop in latencies back in August last month. And that's because suddenly these two companies are able to meet each other in Sofia, which is a little closer, instead of in Frankfurt, which is much farther. And so the performance has improved between these two cities. But it's not the best you can do. I mean, 500 kilometers is pretty easy for a local route if you have the peering right. And you can see that there's one company here, Agrizi, in Georgia, who actually has a direct backup transit relationship with Delta, and they get 10 milliseconds. They've eliminated 90% of the latency for their customers based on a direct interconnect. And so it makes a very big difference where you hand off. If you hand off in Frankfurt, you're going to see 136 milliseconds. If you can hand off in Sofia, it goes down to 96. And if you can interconnect directly, it becomes 10. And this is from Agrizi's website. They're very happy to have this relationship with Azerbaijan because it gives them low latency connectivity on a backup path. And their primary path, of course, is the one through Telia headed off to Stockholm through Russia. But this is the backup path, and through this direct relationship, they have a higher performance connection and more diversity. So let's return to our expanding circles. Here's if you take up to 250 milliseconds. And this is a long time. This is on the edge of not being useful to make VoIP calls, for example. And here, from Baku, we can get to Vladivostok. We can get to almost everywhere in North America and into South America a little bit. We can get all the way to South India. If we go to 250 milliseconds and more, this is a very long connection. But we can go the rest of the world. And you can see that much of the southern hemisphere from Baku is over 250 milliseconds distant, including China. So the Silk Road is not the Silk Road yet. If we had direct interconnection between here and Hong Kong, those numbers would drop to something more reasonable like 100 milliseconds or 150. So this is the opportunity. This is why we look to the internet to grow and replace some of this connectivity. So the next section, let's take a look at some of the numbers. Let's actually take a look at some of the regional providers and how the structure of the local internet stacks up. And And we'll do this en route to a conclusion, which is where we're looking at the shifting sands of the relationships locally, and how it's going to turn out in the future. These are the basic counts. How many autonomous systems are there in each of the regional countries? And the interesting thing here is that in the Caucasus, we have countries of all sizes. We have small countries that are growing quickly, like Georgia and Azerbaijan. We have enormous countries with presence here, like Russia. All different sizes. And if you normalize this by the number of people, we can count the number of autonomous systems per million people. And the US has 48, the Netherlands about 35. And again, you see a whole range of options here. And smaller numbers are countries with fewer ASs per capita. And in some sense, that's just because they are at the start of their journey with the internet instead of at the end or in the middle. So countries like Iran, Azerbaijan, and Iraq are all under less than 4 autonomous systems per million people, but they're in high growth mode. We hope that this is the case, but then we can look at this data a different way. We can pull out not only how many autonomous systems per million people, but also the year-on-year increase, and we can take a look at the largest domestic provider, the largest provider in the country, to find out what percentage of the country they have as a customer. And there's a correlation here. A lot of the countries like Turkey and Iran that have a large domestic provider that has 70 or 80% of the country as a single customer also tend to be the ones that have fewer autonomous systems per million people. And again, this is sort of an evolutionary thing. As a country grows on the internet, it becomes more diverse. The national incumbent relaxes its grip on the customer base, and the diversity goes up, the prices go down, and there are then more autonomous systems for everybody in the country. We can take a look at multi-homing. So in BGP, take an average service provider and ask yourself, how many providers do they have? So as you know, in routing, if you only have one provider, you might as well not be speaking BGP at all, because if that provider fails, you have no backup to go to. You should have 2. Ideally, you should have 3 to fall back on. The dotted line here is the global average, which is to say that still 42% of the ASs in the world are actually still single-homed, and another 39% have 2 providers. And you can see that, again, in the region, that roughly the same trend follows, that in some of the Caucasus countries, we have over 50% of the autonomous systems having only 1 provider, and in many cases, less than 30% having 2. In Turkey, it's unusual because only 9% of them actually have 3, the global average being much, much higher, probably more than 20%. One more metric before we move on. This is the cross-border transit. And you've seen us talk about this one before. This is the percentage of autonomous systems in a country that have signed contracts, that have visible transit coming from international partners. And over the years, we've decided that the data suggests that when more ASs have direct international connectivity, then those ASs have more options. That is, the national incumbent is providing less of a mediating role in hooking up local providers with international transit. And again, the numbers speak for themselves. In Iran, only about 2% of the autonomous systems are able to establish direct international connectivity because almost everything goes through the national incumbent TIC. Then let's move to the final section. Let's take a look at the shifting sands. This is not from here. This is a picture from Dubai, where the roads and the rails are continually covered by sand if you don't take care of it. So let's look at a couple of the interesting regional trends for this emerging Silk Road. The first question that was obvious to me was, is Istanbul still growing as an international regional hub? And I think that there are some concerns here because Istanbul tends to serve the Turkish market only. They, of course, have Turk Telecom International, which does a good job at trying to build international relationships in this region and in the Gulf region. And yet they don't seem, because of political problems, because of difficult neighbors in the Gulf especially, they don't seem to establish large amounts of international connectivity yet. If we measure latencies all over the region from our collection point in Istanbul, you can see that in 50 milliseconds they can make it to Turkey, for sure. They can make it through the Balkans to Eastern Europe, up to Frankfurt, and that's about it. If we wanted to reach the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, if we wanted to reach here into the Caucasus, it's going to take hundreds of milliseconds. And to a large extent, this is because of the relative importance of two great ancient cities. Two great ancient crossroads are battling it out to see who gets to be the regional internet hub to serve, among other places, this region. Istanbul has lost a lot of ground in the last couple of years to Sofia as that submarine cable under the Black Sea picks up steam. You can see here that if you try to go from Baku to Baghdad, especially IQ Networks, which is in the north, you're going to see that these paths go through Sofia. They're not going through Istanbul. They're not following the traditional importance of Istanbul as the Ottoman capital. They're instead going preferentially through Sofia. And so the whole picture is made up of these regional ups and downs. We see Sofia rising as a peering point for this region. Part of that has to do with the fact that regulation in Bulgaria is extremely light, and internet content is very welcome and non-regulated, and that prices are cheap, and that competition is fierce. And the problem here, I think, for Istanbul is that there is a limited amount of time before these things become set in stone, that as the gap becomes wider, the gap becomes wider. We can take a look to the south and take a look at how Iran buys its internet, which is very relevant here. Iran does a very smart job of taking advantage of everything in the region that it can to achieve diverse internet without getting pinned down to a single carrier. So here you can see over time, I think this is over 2014, the portion of TIC, the incumbent, the portion of their transit that is going through each of their regional partners. So you can see Omantel in blue and Telecom Italia in light gray. That's to the south. You can see Turkcell Super Online in the darker green, I believe. And it's a small slice. It's a small slice. You can see Delta Telecom, the Azeri incumbent, with an important role to play here, but becoming less so over time, particularly since in May, Iran came online with Caucasus Online. And we know how they went. They didn't connect through Azerbaijan, despite their longstanding partnership as part of the EPEG consortium. They actually connected through Armenia. This was an outage that hit the Armenian connection to Caucasus Online or to the Caucasus cable system in July. And you can see that Iran's transit changed at exactly the same time as Armenian providers lost their connectivity to Sofia. So the sands shift, relationships change. People always will be taking advantage of the very latest local conditions. And so this is not a competition that will take place once and then be over. This is a wholesale transit and peering competition which will be renewing itself every month for probably forever as the local picture changes and as new facilities come online and as new energy pipelines are constructed and new fiber optics are laid. And so it's possible that the new Silk Road could come through Iran, that Iran could be the national backbone that ultimately links this region to, through this region to Europe and links in Pakistan and India and everybody else through their territory. There is an alternative future, and if those of you who are here will know TASIM, which is the Trans-Eurasian Information Superhighway. This is going to be a proprietary IP network built by the incumbents along the way. It's an interesting route, goes through Kazakhstan, finally crosses the Caspian Sea, comes right through Baku, down through Turkey and on to Europe. Would connect Frankfurt to Hong Kong. You would be able to buy a wave on the new digital Silk Road. Will it happen? I don't know. It's an interesting project. we'll see what happens. That kind of wraps it up. I thank you for the opportunity to present some of this to you, and thank you very much. I'll take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Jim, for this fantastic presentation. Hold on. Are there any questions? Please use the mics, which are not totally working.
So when you search, you don't see about Azerbaijan, it's another one to provide in Azerbaijan. It's more good for in connection to Russia and have more smaller latency. Why?
Yes, I deliberately talked about more southern routes in this presentation. You are absolutely right that Azeri connectivity to Russia is important. I guess what we've measured is that those routes are not primarily used for connectivity to Europe. So when I think about the Silk Road, I'm kind of thinking about European, Central Asian, East Asian connectivity. The routes, the Russian routes, the ones that go through Moscow tend to take a long time. The ones that go through Ukraine, say on EPEG, are good. But I think there are some uncertainties now because of the political conflict.
Thanks.
Are there more questions? I have a question. Yes. I have a question. I have a question. So my question is, the internet is getting optimized for connectivity, right? So we see this through the whole evolution of the internet. But how does it happen? There is no central control. There is no blueprint. So is it word of mouth? Are there any tools that ISPs can use to improve their connectivity? What would you say about that?
Right. I think a lot of it is word of mouth. It is fascinating always that the internet grows without central oversight. That basically it is like the old Silk Road, that you have individual local interests trying to optimize their local situation and trade. They're trying to make the best deals that they can domestically and at their borders with all of the providers and all of the providers from Europe, all of the different physical connectivity alternatives that exist. There are tools that you can use to analyze the connectivity and the presence. RIPE has an excellent set of tools for understanding connectivity and BGP. My company does as well, which I will not mention because this is a non-commercial venue. But overall, I think that it's meetings like this at which people come together and try to talk to each other about the best ways to explore what is possible in terms of connectivity. And the most interesting thing is that the internet never evolves according to the plan. There is always a plan. It's good to have a plan, but we're always pleasantly surprised by how much connectivity comes out of nowhere, and surprises take place, and things happen that we would not predict based on politics or what's in the newspaper in terms of how people connect with each other. So, sure. Right. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.